Okay, good morning, everyone. Look, I'll start the presentation, the webinar. I've just let everyone join. I think we've got most participants that have joined. Welcome. Welcome to the MG Academy Mackay Goodwin webinar. This morning, we will be talking on a very relevant topic, real estate issues due to COVID-19. And with me, we have some key speakers on this topic. We have David Crease and Bartia Perry. He's a partner that does run their commercial and property division at Bartia Perry. And we've got James Johnston, director at Knight Frank. So hopefully all participants will get some value out of this morning's webinar. The agenda for today, I'll quickly provide an introduction on MG Academy. And also talk about the current landscape for commercial rent. Then I'll pass over to our panel lawyer, David, who will talk about rent relief, the legislation, and the reality. And obviously he has been in the trenches, as one would say, on this topic, and give some case studies. Then I'll pass over to James, who'll be talking about the commercial aspect of commercial rent in the current landscape, and he'll give us opportunities for both landlords and tenants. I will then end the webinar on restructuring options for leases, and I'll talk a bit on how you can restructure leases in the insolvency regime. We'll also end the webinar with some Q&A. So for Q&A, there's obviously a little feature on your Zoom app or page. So please click on the Q&A and type your questions. You can type them as we go. And then I'll try and answer them at the end of the webinar. So if you do have a question that you can think of during the webinar, please ask a question via your Q&A feature on your Zoom app. A little bit about MG Academy. So we started MG Academy early this year, and it provides bespoke content in the corporate advisory and restructuring topics. We hope that we can present relevant, up-to-date, tailor-made presentations, and hopefully participants can get some valuable information, education, and also earn some CPD points if they are accountants or lawyers. So on to today's topic. So I'll firstly introduce the current landscape. Obviously, due to COVID-19 and the current lockdowns, businesses are continuing to face uncertainty, especially with the supports ending from the government, such as JobKeeper, rent relief. Those benefits are slowly winding down, and businesses need to get back on their feet and continue trading in normal conditions. The worst performing industries that were impacted by the recent lockdowns obviously were the retail industry, a lot of them, and the hospitality, retail and hospitality, cafes, bars, restaurants. Due to the lockdowns, they had to shut down, and therefore their revenue has been impacted significantly. Based on some recent data that I obtained, we saw that retail rent, only 65% was collected in the end of September 2021 in New South Wales. Commercial tenants paid 82% of commercial rent, so it was due in September 2021. So about 20% of commercial rent still remains outstanding. That's actually improved. The worst collection of commercial rent was May 2020. For that month, it dropped to 63%. It slowly crept up to around 80%, but it's still not ideal for landlords. We are still recovering, and I think both landlords and tenants need to work together to maintain stability for the economy. So that's an intro on the current landscape. I'll pass now the presentation to David.
Thanks very much, Dominic, and good morning, everybody. Well, COVID-19 rent relief. Back in April 2020, a little bit of history first. Back in April 2020, the National Cabinet got together and they hammered out this code of conduct, which they called a mandatory code of conduct. And essentially, what it did was it introduced 14 principles to be applied when affected tenants and landlords were trying to negotiate their way through the very difficult landscape, which meant that businesses were shut, which means obviously no income coming in, and no income coming in, you can't pay your rent. Now, suffice to say, good intentions, but in the implementation, not done so well. I'll just give you a little potted history of the legislation, which I think will demonstrate the difficulties that have been experienced by everyone in the industry in trying to cope with this. So, as I said, National Cabinet hammered out this called mandatory code of conduct back on the 7th of April 2020. Of course, the property industry is based on essentially a state-by-state legislation. So the Commonwealth wasn't actually able to make the code of conduct mandatory by imposing legislation on the various property holders and in New South Wales or the other states. That relied on each state and territory enacting regulations or other legislation that applied the National Code of Conduct. So 7 April, we have the National Code of Conduct. The New South Wales regulations weren't written and introduced until the 24th of April 2020. And even then, they included or failed to include some fairly important points, which the New South Wales government then rectified on the 3rd of July 2020. So we had a bit of uncertainty between the 24th of April and the 3rd of July 2020. Those regulations, when they were initially brought into force, applied to essentially the rent payable and leases between 24th of April and the 24th of October 2020. When those amendments were made on the 3rd of July 2020, that extended that relief to from the 23rd of September until the 31st of December 2020. Luckily for us in New South Wales anyway, we emerged from that first wave of the pandemic there or thereabouts, and we enjoyed a few months of relative freedom, but then second wave came through. And to cope with that second wave, on the 14th of July 2021, the New South Wales government reintroduced these COVID-19 rent relief regulations. And they were initially to apply from the 14th of July to the 20th of August. However, unlike the first lot of regulations, they didn't apply the National Cabinet mandatory code of conduct. They simply said, you can't chuck your tenant out unless you've tried to negotiate and you've gone to mediation first. That was then corrected. Someone realised, and it was corrected on the 13th of August, when the reference to or the need to reference the National Cabinet Code of Conduct was reintroduced, and the rent relief provisions were extended to the 13th of January 2022. So, in dealing with the legislation and rent relief, we have two periods that landlords and tenants need to consider. First, from the 24th of April 2020 to the 31st of December 2020, and secondly, from the 14th of July 2021 to the 13th of January 2022. So we're still in that second period, subject, of course, to the New South Wales government enacting some further legislation that might truncate that. I doubt that in the current circumstances that they will extend it. So I've commented in this slide that the National Cabinet Mandatory Code of Conduct is not mandatory, and that's for the reason I explained, which is the Commonwealth Government can't impose those principles on the states. It's up to the states. And just there were 14 principles, as I mentioned. The main ones are that that landlords have to offer tenants proportionate reductions in rent, and those reductions are in the form of waivers and deferrals. So in other words, some of your rent's waived altogether, you don't have to pay it, and some of the rent is, or the requirement to pay is deferred to a later period. And that could be up to 100% of the rent otherwise payable, depending on the extent to which the tenant is impacted, has been impacted, the extent to which the tenant's turnover in the relevant period has been impacted. And like all these things, the devil's in the detail, and there are some very important words in that code, which and in this principle in particular, which are that it's based on the reduction in the tenant's trade during the COVID-19 pandemic period and a subsequent reasonable recovery period. Now, neither the pandemic period nor the reasonable recovery period were specified in the code. When the New South Wales government came to enact its regulations, it did talk about the relevant period, and those are the ones that I've just mentioned, those two lots of dates, but they didn't say anything about what a reasonable recovery period is. So that was unspecified. So that's something that's out there. The other part of that principle in particular is that the rental waivers, so don't have to pay rent, must constitute not less than 50% of the total reduction. So 50%, at least 50% waiver, and then deferral for the balance. There are other relevant principles, including landlords shouldn't terminate leases unless there's been a period of negotiation and sharing of benefits and so on, and also extending the period of the lease to allow tenants that reasonable period of recovery in which to pay the deferred rent. And these were leasing principles which were expressed to be in good faith. Now, what does good faith mean? That's something that's certainly troubled people in practice, and I'll return to that. So, Dominic, we might go to the next slide if we could. So, not every tenant is entitled to have resort to these principles. You have to be what's called, under the New South Wales provisions, at any rate, an impacted lessee. Now, what's an impacted lessee? Again, going back to these two periods. In the initial period, it was essentially based on whether you were entitled to the JobKeeper payments. And if you could show that you're entitled to the JobKeeper payments, you didn't actually have to be receiving JobKeeper payments, just that you're entitled to it, then you are an impacted lessee, and your landlord couldn't terminate the lease for non-payment of rent unless these good faith negotiations had been entered and run their course. Now, in the second period, to be an impacted lessee, because we didn't have JobKeeper anymore, somewhat controversially. So the eligibility came down to tenants who qualify for the New South Wales grants and so on that were introduced, the micro business grant, the New South Wales business grant, and the JobSaver grant. So you had to prove this. Again, nothing in the regulation said exactly how you had to prove it, but in the most cases, tenants were providing BAS statements. There were letters from accountants. They were providing actual turnover figures. One of the difficulties is that those turnover figures had to relate to the period before and after the pandemic period, those regulated periods. And that meant if you didn't have a history, you didn't qualify. So if you opened your business in the second period, somewhat optimistically, or the period in between the lockdowns, somewhat optimistically, you don't qualify as being an impacted lessee because you've got nothing to compare your reduction in turnover with. And it's about reduction in turnover, not just turnover. Now, the second significant issue with the rent relief provisions is this negotiate in good faith. What does that mean? It's not defined. Can a landlord, for example, say, okay, well, you've qualified as being an impacted lessee, so I have to negotiate with you, but that doesn't mean that I have to offer you any particular deferral and waiver. I can say as a landlord, well, the leasing principles also refer to the ability of landlords to survive without receiving rent. So in our particular situation, I'm not going to offer you a waiver and deferral for the amount of your reduction in turnover. I'm going to offer you something less. The tenant, on the other hand, of course, is saying, well, not only do I want, or might be saying, not only do I want that amount that's equivalent to my reduction in turnover, I want more because I anticipate that the effect on me and my business is going to be more significant than another business. Is this good faith negotiation? Does good faith negotiation mean you look at the national code and you apply it strictly? Not necessarily. And then what happens if the landlord and the tenant can't come to an agreement? Again, national code being mandatory, how do you mandate, how do you force people into agreement? Now, what the code said was you then need to go to and use the mediation services that are provided by the various, usually the Departments of Fair Trading in the various states. And here it's the Office of the Small Business Commissioner who offers a mediation service. And the National Code of Conduct used the phrase binding mediation. Now, that's an oxymoron. The very essence of mediation is not that decisions are imposed on the parties, but that an independent facilitator assists the parties to get to an agreement. So there is every possibility, and in our experience it certainly happens, that despite the best efforts of the mediator, the parties don't reach agreement. So there's no such thing as binding mediation. And that then leads to the end of the road, which is we can't reach agreement. Who's going to tell us what we're supposed to do? Surely that's the courts and the tribunals. But the courts and the tribunals in particular don't have the ability, they don't have the power, they don't have the jurisdiction to remake the parties' bargains. They can't say, well, we think that a reasonable result, bearing in mind the National Code of Conduct, and the courts and tribunals are required by the legislation to keep in mind the National Code of Conduct, but nonetheless, they can't simply take a lease and vary it without the agreement of the parties. Now, this is a classic myth and misunderstanding. So in terms of real life examples, firstly, our firm acted for the tenant in the Sneaker Boy case, which you may have heard of, and it's one of the, probably was the first significant reported case in relation to these COVID-19 rent relief provisions. Now, very briefly, what happened there was Sneaker Boy, the tenant, had fallen behind in its rent prior to the introduction of the rent relief provisions. Of course, it got worse once the pandemic hit. The landlord sought to terminate the lease. Now, at law, there is a principle which says that if, although the tenant has breached the lease and the landlord is in a position to terminate the lease, the tenant can go to the court and say, look, I accept that I breached the lease and the landlord is otherwise entitled to terminate it. But because a lease is it's an interest in land, it's such an important thing, if I can show you that I can make up for the default in the lease, the court can give what's called relief against forfeiture of the lessee's interest, the tenant's interest in the lease, and reinstate the lease, provided that the tenant does make up for the previous defaults. Now, the problem here was, what was the rent that Sneaker Boy ought to pay in relation to the pandemic period? Because remember, in the pandemic period, we have this injunction to negotiate in good faith the reduced amount of rent. And if the landlord and the tenant can't agree what that reduced amount of rent is, how is the court then supposed to say, well, this is what the tenant needs to do in order to cure the default, and for the court to give relief against forfeiture? So that was the nub of the problem in the Sneaker Boy case. And ultimately, what the court did was that it firstly gave the parties guidance as to what the court would consider is reasonable, and then secondly gave us some guidance, gave all of us some guidance as to what it considers a reasonable recovery period to be. Because again, under the national principles, it talks about the pandemic period and a reasonable recovery period. The New South Wales regulations only define the pandemic period, not the recovery period. And what the court said in the Sneaker Boy case was a reasonable recovery period is probably about 6 months, could be up to 6 months. So when a landlord and a tenant is negotiating for a reduction in rent and the waivers and deferrals, it's not just the pandemic period, it's also a period after that that needs to be taken into account. So that's what the court was able to do. And the courts have greater powers than the tribunals. And one of the things that we've found often happens is that tenants in particular will go to the New South Wales Civil and Administrative Tribunal, which is the first port of call, as it were, for retail lease disputes. So that's all your coffee shops and cafes and bars and things. The tenants go to the tribunal and they want the tribunal to make an order varying their lease, or they want the tribunal to require the landlord to reach agreement. And if the landlord can't reach agreement, tell the landlord what the landlord has to say, has to agree to. The tribunal simply doesn't have that power. It can't vary the lease, it can't remake the lease, it can't force the landlord to do anything in terms of agreeing to a change in the terms of the lease and the rent. The most the tribunal can do is to say either the landlord isn't entitled to terminate the lease because it hasn't negotiated in good faith, or to say, well, this amount of rent isn't due and owing as yet because there haven't been proper negotiations or there hasn't been a mediation. That's as much as the tribunal can do. So again, it's thrown very much back onto the tenants and the landlords. And if you have a situation where both the landlord and the tenant aren't aware of their rights and their powers and the jurisdiction of the courts and tribunals, it really leaves them in limbo. And that's what we found, that with a lot of premises, that there is no agreement. The tenant isn't paying the rent, or is only paying part of the rent. The landlord isn't receiving the rent, wants to terminate the tenant, but doesn't know how to go about it. So it's a real uncertain industry out there, particularly with retail and commercial tenants. And of course, it hasn't played itself out as yet, because as I said, under the New South Wales regulations, we still have until the 13th of January 22 of a pandemic period still going. So I imagine that makes it very, very difficult for those in the industry to work out what a correct rent is, to valuers to work out what rents are, and to predict with any kind of certainty as to what is going to happen in that market. Thanks, Dominic.
Thanks, David. Look, while I've got you, I do have one question, and I'll ask it now.
Sure.
Question is, so would a tenant's credit rating be affected if they defaulted on a lease and then had to go to mediation?
If they did that outside the COVID periods, outside the pandemic periods, then yes, it would. The issue is it's a good question, because the issue is going to be, well, why should my credit rating be affected if it's due to the COVID situation, which has been recognised by the government as not our fault, and nothing to do with our ability to trade our business? Then again, credit, you talk about, well, what is the business? What business are you in? Is it a risky business? So that's going to affect your credit rating if that's where your income is coming from. So I think the practical answer is that yes, it will be.
Okay. Thanks, David. Okay, I'll now hand over to James for the next part of the presentation.
Great, thanks, Dominic, and again, thanks for having me. I think when we're talking about the property market in Sydney, especially, and that's what I've predominantly focused on because that's what I know. There's I suppose in the commercial world, there's three major sectors. There's obviously rural and residential property, which I've excluded because I don't know enough about them, and I'll let the current affairs programs talk about what's going on in those markets. But essentially, we can break Sydney down into three different markets. There's sheds. It's called a lot of other complicated terms like industrial logistics and things like that, but essentially there's sheds that hold stuff. I've excluded manufacturing from that because it really is probably a waning industry. There's retail, food and beverage, which is essentially your ground floor plane or your high street retail. And then there's commercial office street, which I think everyone's relatively familiar with in this market. Just go to the next slide, Dominic. So I think before we get into what are the opportunities for landlords and tenants, we need to know what was going to happen but for COVID. So it's important to know in the industrial sector in particular that land supply was a concern from Sydney, that they're not making any more of it in Sydney, and it was already constrained. This was leading to a pent-up demand for new buildings, for land to be released, and there was a lot of pressure on governments, but it certainly was not solved, and COVID hasn't helped it. There was a lot of I suppose the demand side of it came from new retail entrants and essentially the 3PL or the logistics sector coming in and looking for new ways to distribute their goods. The other factor that was starting to occur, or that we've really seen progress over the last, let's say, 8 to 10 years, is the enhanced efficiency of how we're using warehouse management plans, and the way that we now build warehouses, where we're heavily focused on volume, not so much the two-dimensional square meters on the ground floor plane. So the easiest example is if you go out to the Enora distribution centre, you'll notice that they've got the old store sawtooth wool stores. They still exist, but everything that's being built new out in that area is probably 2 to 3 times the height. So, you know, obviously industrial warehousing is now about the volume of the shed, not so much about just the size of the floor plate. We've then got the retail and food and beverage sector in Sydney. And I think it's important to go back and remember what was happening pre-COVID. George Street had a lot of hoarding up. It had been dug up. There was a lot of blokes there with jackhammers and a lot of arguing between the state government and some contractors. But essentially they were building the light rail through the centre of Sydney. That had a big impact on retail, the way pedestrian flows worked, congestion and all sorts of things. We were seeing e-commerce, I suppose, be a threat. There was a lot of commentary about how much of a threat it was going to be on retail. Was it going to be the death of retail shopping centres and those types of things? And then we also saw the emergence of two major factors. The recreation of George Street becoming a new luxury retail precinct, and then instant destinations. And by that, I simply mean, where can you go to eat a meal, to take a photo on Instagram, to show your friends that you've been there eating a meal? So I suppose Justin Hems is probably the king of this. You've also got the likes of the Grounds of Alexandria, who had their original precinct in Alexandria, and then they've opened up sort of multiple different reincarnations of that in Sydney CBD. So that was what was happening in that sector pre-COVID. With the commercial office sector, it's a really interesting sector in Sydney. We need to remember that the government had started building the metro train stations, which had actually reduced or demolished a number of buildings and reduced the actual overall supply. Round figures, it depends on who you talk to and how you measure it, but it might have been something around about the 200 to 250,000 square metre supply withdrawal directly related to metro, which in Sydney CBD is around about 2% of the total supply. So it is when we look at vacancy rates, that is a big ticket item, but when we look at the overall market, it's not material. Prior to COVID, and I've got some charts coming up, but prior to COVID, Sydney CBD was meant to reach all-time record low vacancy rates, essentially. That didn't materialise, but that was the way the market was headed. That's the way everyone was looking. Incentives were coming down, face rents were going up, and everyone was focused on the next sort of 3 to 4 years, which we're currently in that sort of window right now. But in 2019, we were looking at 2020, 2021, 2022 at being really bad times for tenants to be on the hook to be renegotiating their commercial leases. And there was also, that was heavily driven by limited new supply. So the new supply that was being delivered, or that is going to be delivered in 2022, it was predominantly pre-committed. And I mean, the big three items there are Key Quarter Tower, which is 50 Bridge Street, or the AMP building, Salesforce Tower, which is Circular Quay Tower, which is in front of the old Jacksons on George, and then 210 George Street, which is a much smaller development. So they were the things that were being touted as being the new supply. Wynyard Place obviously came online and is now just activated sort of this year. But there was essentially this situation where even with this new development coming into Sydney, that was just a stopgap measure to make up for what was actually lacking in the longer term. If you just flick over, please, Dominic. So these two charts I've grabbed, I don't want to have too many graphs in my presentation, because whilst I love them, I know a lot of people get a little bit bored by them, and it's not the basis of my argument. But essentially on the left-hand side of the screen, this was the prediction as at 2019. So you can see the vacancy rate, obviously a downward trend. And then the right-hand side of the screen is from September this year, where we can obviously see that that downward trend in vacancy rate didn't actually occur, and the vacancy rate increased. So just to give you an indication, obviously that was headed towards below 4%. The current PCA rates in Sydney CBD are 9.2%. However, we also need to look at the way those are measured. A lot of people will argue that it's materially higher than that, but for the purpose of this demonstration, you still know that the gap between below 4% and 9% is material. If you could just click over, please, Dominic. Then I suppose we need to look at the COVID impact. What was the level of occupancy in office buildings? So this chart I quite like. It just shows from the start of the pandemic in 2020 to what happened just before the second lockdown. So it's sort of, I suppose, gives you an indication of the recovery rate from the last shutdown. It doesn't actually tell you what happened this shutdown, obviously, because we're still just in the process of coming out of that. But the key city I want to pick on is the People's Republic of Western Australia and their imperial capital of Perth, I suppose. So it's a bit of an oxymoron calling imperial capital. But if you look at Perth CBD rate, they still, for I don't know what you call Western Australia, but for that economy, it still didn't really get back above 80% or not for a long term. So I suppose Western Australia looked at what other countries like Australia were doing and said, those people aren't coming back to the office, so we shouldn't come back to the office. And I think this really dictates the way, or the mentality that we have moving forward, is that I think we've come to a realization that we don't actually need to turn up to the office. People were sitting here on a hamster treadmill, running, coming into the city every day going, I need to be in the city, I've got to be there. And then all of a sudden the hamster wheel stopped and everyone jumped off, and people sort of realized that they don't actually need to jump back on that hamster wheel to do their job. There's certainly very good reasons to be in the city, to be in your team, to be in your office, to get all that stuff done. But there's a lot of people, and I'm certainly one of those people, who say, I can be at home effectively and it's business as usual. However, there's other people in my team and there's other people in my firm who would sit in the office and say, it would be nice to have the retail team, it would be nice to have the research team, it would be nice to have the valves team, it would be nice to have the industrial team here, so I can just ask a quick question and we can share the knowledge of the entire business. And that's something that we need to keep in mind when we're saying, do we come back to the office, and how does that return to the office look? Because it's, whilst a lot of people can work effectively from home, no one's really worked out how much of the time we need to be in the office for those businesses to function. But like I said, if anyone is under any doubt or believes that we will have a 100% return to pre-occupancy rates, my view is that if Perth, with everything that their one-party state-led government did with their lockdowns, they still didn't actually get back to a consistency above 80%. And that's I suppose, if you look at the CBDs, Adelaide, Darwin, Hobart are relatively small. Perth isn't a massive CBD, but it is still materially bigger than the rest of the ones shown on the chart. You just keep going, Dominic. So I guess then we look at the pandemic and what did happen. So the sheds, they're full and there's no land left. The best analogy I've got is that if anyone sort of has been sitting in their house and looking out the window and watching the Australia Post or Star Trek Express delivery people roll around, the guy who delivers in our area has gone from a station wagon. He then upgraded to a Mitsubishi Express van, and now he owns a small bus. So my children were sitting here during the pandemic. They've called him Santa Claus, and every day Santa Claus just had more and more deliveries. The guy's probably lost 15 kilos. He now jogs between houses when he's delivering the parcels. And I tell you what, he's almost ready to run on for first grade. He's really fit. He's in great shape. I feel for him, because I think if he was doing this in summer, I just don't know how much Gatorade the guy would have to drink, but it's been a real improvement for his health. And obviously he's upgraded from the van to the mini bus, which obviously shows that he's actually doing quite well. Food and beverage and retail. So it was shut down or on heavily restricted trading. And the only thing that I've noticed since I came back to the city, and I've been working in last week and this week, is there's two businesses which were a little bit surprising to me. The first one probably shouldn't have been surprising, but every single barbershop in City CBD had a lineup out the front. That's a great example of pent-up demand. So I think we're going to see a real kick in those retail figures. We're going to see a real kick in people going, I can spend money again, great, let's go out there, let's line up at Kmart when it opens at midnight, the day after lockdown shuts. That's great. I think we will see that, and we'll see an unartificial quick increase because people just want to spend some money for a change. But then the other very interesting thing that I saw was every luxury goods retailer I walked out in front of, Louis Vuitton, I walked past Burberry yesterday, also had a lineup out the street. Now, I'm not going to criticize people who shop there, but I wouldn't call that as essential as me needing my haircut pre and post pandemic. So the luxury goods market, it probably shows that was relatively resilient. I'm sure you can buy these things online. I could be wrong. I don't personally shop there on a regular basis, but it does show that there is a rejuvenation of George Street. There is more luxury coming in, and that is there for a reason. And that was the way that a lot of businesses position themselves. We did see one of the key statistics was that online sales in March 2021 were about 9.4% of online, and that's for non-food, and the 5-year average is 4.7. So we are seeing that trend increase. That's obviously going to affect retail, but what it does to food and beverage, we just don't know until people do or don't return into the city. The final thing was with commercial office, what did happen? Everyone went home. That had a big impact, again, on the shed market and the retail and food and beverage market, because you've seen a phenomenon where people are now working from home. They're going down to the local cafe and they're dropping 10 or 15 bucks on a sandwich because that's what they're used to doing in Sydney CBD. Plus we'll grab a coffee, and then in the evening we might get some Uber and some things like that. Now these, I suppose, retail or metro areas just were not geared to delivering those types of meals at lunch. And you saw a lot of those businesses actually perform quite well. My wife and I happen to own a cafe. We're in the business. The one thing we did notice is that it made a horrendous difference to our trading pattern, whereas typically during the day we were relatively flat with a peak at night, and now we're relatively good during the day. And then with the lockdown, we absolutely died at night because there was no other food and beverage open. So with everyone working from home, we also need to remember Sydney's a big place. There's a lot of different markets, and not every market was affected differently. So I would say that Sydney CBD obviously got crushed, but the metro markets around Sydney CBD or the suburban markets, you will see that the retail food and beverage actually kicked up. I think there's a lot of people are saying that, you know, with the Uber generation, or with the phenomenon that's created, that has helped retailers has helped food and beverage. And I'll be happy to have this discussion with everyone, but it certainly hasn't, because the margin that they're taking out is really eats into those retailers' margins. So I don't think that is going to enhance retail and food and beverage, but the fact that people are now working at home more will actually correct that market. If you just tick over, please, Don. So the crux of what we're looking at here is, what are the opportunities and the tenants, what are the opportunities for tenants, and landlords moving forward? So I think the first thing you need to overcome, and as David sort of showed, it's as clear as mud what the actual outcomes can be, is you need to get your COVID negotiation out of the way. That's the first thing that you need to get done. Everyone needs to realise that not all markets are the same. So Sydney CBD is performing extremely differently to North Sydney, to Macquarie Park, to Parramatta. They're different markets with different types of tenants. They exist for different reasons. And yeah, whilst people might say that Macquarie Park, or people will say that Macquarie Park is the worst performing long-term office market in Sydney, it's actually done relatively well through the pandemic, and it hasn't really been as affected. That's perhaps to do with the tenancy mix or a number of other items, but you can't just say that broad brush, generally speaking, every commercial office market has done poorly and every metro market's done well. There's obviously a massive difference between the markets. We need to probably look at what's happened to the flex market. It will become a bigger factor, I believe, and I think there's a lot of people who share my view. Post-lockdown, the flex market will actually deliver an opportunity for people to have a more diverse workforce. And by that, sorry, I mean geographically diverse workforce, make it easier for people to react quickly. Landlords need to look at, and tenants need to look at, what is a good covenant moving forward. You know, traditionally, there were certain businesses who were great covenants, and you know, video stores is probably a great example of one. They were considered a great covenant. They would always pay the rent. Now it's a situation where they just don't exist in the market anymore. So landlords need to track, is a tech company now a good covenant? Is a bank a good covenant? You know, especially in a metro retail high street, does a bank need to exist anymore as a branch, or would you look at replacing them with a restaurant if you had the opportunity? What does cost recovery look like? Is there, because landlords are going to be looking at, do they kick the tenant out, or do they try and stay with the tenant? And tenants will be looking at, do I just leave the premises, go somewhere else and try and recover rent, or do I stay there and just pay the rent and suck it up? So long story short, if you're a tenant, if you're just deciding on, do I walk away from the property or not, you need to understand how much rent you're going to get back. That might be anywhere between 0 and 70%, depending on where you sit. And for the landlord, if they kick the tenant out, how long is it going to take them to replace it? And are they better sort of letting the tenant sort of limp along and getting some kind of cost recovery? I suppose the other thing you need to look at is how you reposition your property. Is an opportunity, is your use for your property, again, if we go to the retail example of a bank branch leaving, is it ever going to be a bank branch again? Well, the answer is probably no. So can you reposition your property in this market? And then tenants, you need to look at, I suppose, relocation and new strategies. Do you now need a premises on a high street, or can you go to a back street and become a destination? So if you just go to the next slide, please, Dominic. So for the landlords, I think the key goal moving forward is to attract and retain tenants. There's no doubt cash flow is probably going to be king for a lot of landlords, but not all. We're in a great situation for landlords where interest rates are essentially, historic all-time lows. They might look like going up next year, but it's not going to be probably material. There are obviously different advantages to being in different situations for landlord. If you've got an occupied property, you've got cash flow. If you've got a high sublease vacancy, you've still got cash flow, but you know that it's going to come off and you need to start future planning. What do you do with your fit out? How do you sort of try and get new tenants into that? Vacant property, I guess the upside or the opportunity for landlords is investor and purchaser demand is still extremely strong. We've seen prime cap rates in Sydney CBD for institutional properties slip down to around about that 4.5% mark. So is there buyer demand? Yeah, absolutely there is. Residential auction clearance rates don't necessarily reflect commercial, but there is a lot of people with a lot of cash out there ready to spend on commercial property because, as we can see, interest rates at 0.1% is putting pressure on other ways for people to get a reasonable rate of return out of their money. Leasing transactions, so they're up 125% on 2020. I mean, you would want them to be. In 2020, we saw tenants kick the can down the road, not want to make a decision, just want to sort of sit back and work it out. In 2021, I think we've seen a situation where tenants are like, okay, well, we know things are going to go back to normal. We know that we believe that the vaccination program is going to occur and help, and people are going to start moving back into offices at some stage. So let's make a decision now. So for landlords with sitting on vacant properties, look, there are a lot of transactions, especially in Sydney CBD. Good buying at the moment for landlords. There's a lot of vacant properties with landlords who don't have the capital to reinvest or reposition the asset. So if you're a cashed up buyer and you're looking at a metro market that's had a property in it which has defaulted a tenant, or that the owner is the traditional, not the traditional owner, but the long-term owner who operated their business in it, paid off the property and then retired and then has just leased it out. That's sort of, I suppose, the majority of that high street retail in a lot of areas. You will find that you can go in, buy those properties, spend the money to fix the leak in the roof, and that will actually be the difference between attracting a tenant or not. It's just that capital investment, which a lot of those landlords don't have. And then yields, like I said, so prime CBD commercial yields are sitting, they've nudged on that 4.4% mark. So they're obviously still strong. If we just go over the last one, Dominic. So then for tenant opportunities, I guess, with all the COVID rent relief and what's going on, there's obviously different matrix, different tenants use for their occupancy costs. But if we look at retailers and commercial tenants, it might be between that 10 and 20% of turnover mark. So I think for office tenants, most of them want to sit, apart from, and again, for professional services, apart from wages, property is probably your second biggest line item. And a lot of, I suppose, businesses look at that and say, look, that's between, let's say, 8 and 12%. How do we actually reduce that? The question might be moving forward is, instead of how do we reduce our rent, we perhaps need to look at how do we use our property to attract talent? Because I don't think we're in a situation now coming out of pre-pandemic. There's been a little bit of commentary, which I haven't read into, saying that come March, everyone's going to quit their jobs and move to Bali. But I think that attraction and retention of talent is going to be really essential. So as a tenant, as an office occupying tenant, what do you do with your office strategy? You're probably looking past the point of survival now because you've survived. For retailers, you're probably still in perhaps survival mode. But for office tenants, you need to look at how do I attract and retain that tenant, those new staff members moving forward. So relocation or renegotiation is what's there. The opportunity for tenants are to go to the landlords and say, look, you need tenure, you need a longer lease, I want a discount. Can I take more term and then bring a discount forward that I'm going to get out of a new incentive? We have seen face rents in Sydney CBD move relatively sideways in spite of what's been happening, but incentives have dropped. So we've now got a gap of around about 30%, let's say 30 to 35%, sitting there where tenants can sign a new lease and take a 30 to 35% discount up front as either a capital contribution to refit or as a rental abatement spread evenly over the term. So there is a big discount there for tenants who are prepared to back themselves and put themselves on a longer lease. The occupancy strategy for some tenants, a lot of tenants might now start, you hear the term hub and spoke, where you got a Sydney CBD presence and then you got a satellite office in, Manly, Bondi, Parramatta, all the other surrounding offices. That's where the flex strategy will come into place, because you will have some flexible office providers or service office providers who will be able to facilitate that faster. But I think you might see a lot more people move to the model whereby they can provide a flexible office as well as having a core CBD office. There's always going to be a flight to quality. 126 Phillip Street or Deutsche Bank Place is the great example of that, whereby through the pandemic and for whatever reason, and I'm certainly not giving credit to the landlord there. It might have been luck, it might have been strategy. Their building was relatively full and they were doing relatively aggressive deals compared to the rest of the premium market at that point in time. So you will always see, though, tenants still wanting to go to those types of buildings. There has been a lot of transactions, I suppose, with tenants trying to step up a class in building because the discounts are there. The other, I suppose, key factor you need to look at as a tenant is, do you actually need to work in a physical premises, or can you become a destination and can you move out of physical property? Now, I think a lot of professional services firms can do that to an extent, and that's where you'll see 1,000 square metre users become 700 or 500 square metre users, and they'll go to a more flexible model. But until people actually start transacting, I think that's sort of up for debate. I think we will see a lot of tenants downsizing and reducing their space, but I think we'll also see tenants changing the way they actually use their space, having more collaboration. Sure, you probably jam a few more seats in, but the way you use your space will no longer be for a set desk or a set office. It might be more for collaboration, presentation space, client space, and then I suppose a flexible or a activity-based working platform out the back. You'll also see, I guess, tenants in retail and hospitality say, can we become a destination outlet? If we can, let's go to a cheaper alternative, or if we can't, sit here in the high street and try and move to a shop which offers a better fit out or a better standard for a lower rent. But that's essentially it for me. Thanks, Dominic.
Thanks, James. Yeah, that was great, very insightful. I'll go to questions at the end. There's a few questions that are coming through, but I'll just quickly talk about leases and restructuring and options available in the insolvency regime. There's been a lot of talk about rent relief and negotiation of rent. So obviously there's quite a lot of tenants out there, especially in the retail, food and beverage, and the travel. We've had a few companies in the travel industry that are being impacted significantly due to COVID. So sometimes they do need to go beyond the negotiations on rent. So there's really 4 options that we see that tenants have. Obviously, the first one is the informal negotiation. Now, when I say informal, I mean, it doesn't need an appointment of a voluntary administrator or a liquidator, and is the cheapest and safest method. It doesn't have any damage to the goodwill of a business. It's done behind closed doors, so it's not made public. And hopefully, the tenants can negotiate their rent in an informal way. However, there is some risk. And the main risk is if they do have other debts that have been incurring in the same period, and one of those creditors do end up ultimately winding up their business, then the negotiation that they've been able to achieve gets unwound, and they're back to square one with an insolvency appointment. So obviously, directors, we do advise strongly, if they are looking at negotiating their rent, they also need to consider other debts that they do have outstanding. So the main 3 options in the insolvency regime is, the first one is a small business restructure. This is new legislation that was introduced in January this year. And it's basically the same effect of a voluntary administration. To be able to be eligible for a small business restructure, you need liabilities of less than $1 million. If your liabilities are greater than $1 million, then you have to look at a voluntary administration. So in effect, both a small business restructure and a voluntary administration is to renegotiate your debts via a mechanism called a deed accompanying arrangement. Now, landlords aren't bound by a deed accompanying arrangement, so tenants, if they are looking at renegotiating their leases via voluntary administration, during the voluntary administration, tenants can't terminate the lease or enter into possession. However, once the voluntary administration ends and a deed accompanying arrangement is accepted by creditors, the landlord can continue terminating a lease. So it's important that tenants do negotiate and do participate, allow the landlords to participate in the negotiation of a deed accompanying arrangement. They are quite common. We, in October, had 2 voluntary administrations that went into a deed accompanying arrangement, and they both involved a landlord, and the landlord was happy to continue a business in existence via a deed accompanying arrangement. So they are quite powerful. However, it is important that you have the landlords on board, and usually landlords see that as a positive step. Normally, deeds of company arrangement do release cash flow, which will enable a tenant to be able to meet ongoing rental expenses a lot easier. And then the final option, which is probably the last option businesses want to take, is to liquidate and sell the business. So a liquidator can sell the business via as a going concern, and the lease can be transferred to the new purchaser. So that's an option for tenants if they do need to enter into the insolvency regime and they can't pay their rent, and the landlord needs to collect that rent. Obviously, in all 4 options, especially the last 3, the insolvency regime options, the directors of the business need to make sure that the personal guarantees are covered. In all options, regardless of a business entering into a voluntary administration or a deed company arrangement, landlords can continue pursuing personal guarantees. So obviously, when negotiating your rent, you need to ensure that your personal guarantees are part of that negotiation. That's my part on the options. Now we're basically at 12:30 nearly, so I'll go through some questions. If anyone has any questions, by all means, please do ask. So I'll go through. I've got a few, and I'll have a quick conversation. But one question I've got is for James. Do you see a future for long-term commercial leases in the current market, for example, over 5 years?
Look, no matter what anyone else says, Dominic, we all know that accountants rule the world, and there's a factor called depreciation. There's 2 components to starting a new office. There's the capital expense of the fit out, and then there's the operational expense of paying the rent. So yes, you'll see that Cause Chambers have just committed to a 10-year lease, even in the pandemic market, and they're burning their lease tail at 8 Chifley. That's simply to be able to have the money to fund, I suppose, or to equitably fund the new fit out that they're going to put in there. So yes, I think you will see 5 and 10-year leases come back in, but you'll have a lot more flexibility around expansion and contraction rights. Without that depreciation, or without the ability to spread the capital cost of fit out over a 5 to 10-year period, it's just going to be too expensive for tenants to move, and tenants aren't going to, with the current talent attraction wars, they're not going to sit in 10-year-old fit outs for longer than they need to. So yes, there will absolutely be a need for 5 and 10-year leases moving forward, just with more flexibility. You might also see landlords, I suppose, instead of just providing capital incentives, owning a larger component of the fit out than they traditionally had.
Okay. A question on my end. How do you see commercial space in the CBD, especially now that we've got the remote workforce and the increase of a remote workforce? How do you see it picking up, or do you see problems in that space?
So the sub 500 square meter market between the lockdowns last time was absolutely red hot. We were, frankly, we were struggling to keep control of stock in that situation when we were representing tenants. So yes, that sub 500 square meter mark, obviously it's a relatively vanilla fit out. Tenants can move quickly because there's not many of them. So yeah, that was absolutely going ahead. And then the sublease space that was on the market, you've got to remember that if the likes of Macquarie Bank drop 3,000 square meters of space, it's back of house floor. So for you to come in and take that 3,000 square meters off Macquarie, you've still got to build a front of house, you've still got to build meeting rooms, you've still got to build a kitchenette because it doesn't exist. So the most capital intensive parts of the fit out aren't there, which then sort of, reduces the effectiveness of taking that discount. If you just want it for project space, fantastic. So when you're looking at the sublease space coming onto the market, it's not always there for tenants. I think there certainly will be a recovery, but there'll be an exceptionally high volume of transactions, which means that landlords have got the opportunity to take tenants off other landlords. But I think you'll see everyone reducing space ever so slightly. So instead of, like I said, instead of a 1,000 square meter tenant, that tenant might now be 700 square meters. The transactions will still be there for the right landlords who are well positioned to take advantage of it, and the right tenants will still be able to come in and get their discount. Face rents might be maintained, but incentives will certainly be large enough to incentivize tenants to then relocate and refit their office.
Great, thank you. Another question is, James, have you seen many examples of hub and spoke leading to commitment to non-CBD satellite offices since the pandemic began?
Yeah, so look, there's very few tenants who are big enough to instigate a hub and spoke strategy. If you look at, I suppose, opportunities lost, CBA is probably one of those where they did have, they got a number of offices through Sydney. They committed to South Everleigh, and they didn't instigate that strategy. I think they're probably one of the smarter corporate. Since they moved to after they moved to Olympic Park, which failed, they've been one of the smarter corporate property occupiers. But no one's had the lease tenure, I think, or none of the big sort of corporate tenants have had the lease tenure to give them the opportunity to investigate that model quick, sort of efficiently. So short answer, no. However, I think through a flex platform or a flex pattern, that's when we'll start to see it open up for the sort of the smaller 2,000 square metre tenants. But no, short answer, I've heard a lot of people talk about hub and spoke. No one's instigated it, but I think that's because of they're sitting on a 5-year lease tail, or they're sitting on a 7-year lease tail, or a 3-year lease tail, and they just simply haven't had the lease expiry there to be able to instigate that strategy.
Thanks, James. David, question for you. Have you seen an increase in landlords in collecting rent through the recovery process? So are you seeing wind-ups commenced by landlords? And also you're seeing landlords pursuing personal guarantees due to rent that was incurred during the pandemic?
Yes, we are. Landlords clearly suffering like tenants, and they are doing everything they can to try and get those rents. But I think overall, landlords are tending to be more patient with their tenants and trying to work things out with their tenants. So because there's been an increase in defaults under leases, yes, there's been an increase in landlords trying to collect them, trying to do, wind-ups, but certainly in terms of collecting the personal guarantees and the bonds and the calling on bank guarantees. But I think to be fair, I think most of them are sitting and trying to work it out.
Okay, thanks, Well, I think that's all the questions that we have today. So thank you, James. Thank you, David, for presenting. It was great. Hopefully, participants gained some knowledge from today's presentation. We will post the presentation for anyone that wants to watch it again. And if anyone has any questions, by all means, myself, James, and David can hopefully answer your questions if you can think of any after the presentation. But on that note, thank you all for attending, and have a great remaining day. Thank you all.
Thanks all.
Thanks, guys. Thanks. See you later.